In the early hours of November 4th, 2017, Saudi Arabia changed forever. Across the country, princes, bureaucrats, and businessmen who had long believed themselves above the law discovered that their immunity had evaporated. Charged with corruption, some were pulled from their beds, while others were summoned to non-existent meetings or detained as soon as their international flights touched down in the kingdom. Among them were Air Force generals, Navy admirals, and 3 sons of former King Abdullah, including the commander of the Saudi Arabian National Guard. A former minister of finance and a governor of the central bank found themselves confined together with former ministers of commerce, planning, and communications. Along with 3 brothers of Osama bin Laden, some 300 prominent individuals were taken to Riyadh's Ritz-Carlton Hotel, which was converted for the occasion into the world's first 5-star prison. These events marked the end of an order that had governed Saudi Arabia for 65 years.
Welcome to Middle East Centre Booktalk, the Oxford podcast on new books about the Middle East. These are some of the books written by members of our community, or the books our community are talking about. My name is Eugene Rogan, and I teach the modern history of the Middle East. My guest is David Rundell. David came to Oxford in 1976 to read for the MPhil in Modern Middle Eastern Studies. He was a student of Albert Hourani's and a direct contemporary of New York Times columnist Tom Friedman. After completing the MPhil in 1978, David entered the U.S. Foreign Service. In 1981, he was posted as a political officer to the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, marking the beginning of a 30-year career in diplomacy, 16 of those spent in Saudi Arabia alone. He retired in 2010 as chief of mission at the American Embassy in Riyadh. As America's most experienced Saudi hand, friends and colleagues have long anticipated his book on Saudi Arabia, Vision or Mirage? Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. The book was published in 2020 by Bloomsbury's IB Tauris imprint to critical acclaim. The Wall Street Journal declared it a book of staggering breadth and depth, and the New York Times claimed, Rundell covers the kingdom from top to bottom with vast wisdom, depth, and understanding. Given the pace of change witnessed in the once conservative Saudi kingdom over the past 5 years, this is a timely book. David, welcome to Book Talk.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be back at Oxford, although I have to say, in many ways, I never left. It's always with me, and certainly in spirit and in the intellectual training that I received there.
Well, we're delighted to have you back to the Middle East Centre community, where presumably your engagement with the Middle East really took off. Did your Oxford studies in any way prepare you for the professional challenges that you faced once you got to the region?
Most definitely they did. I often felt that my training was the key in many ways to my success. Not only the Arabic, which I had learned, but the kind of Arabic that I had learned and the history and politics that I'd also gathered. And I'll just be very quick about that. But, you know, I'll tell you a story. When I was walking into the hall, I was at Queen's, and I was going into hall one afternoon, and my moral tutor was with me, and he said, well, how are things going? And I said, well, things are going okay, but, you know, I want to join the Foreign Service, and I want to go to the Middle East, and they're teaching me to read the Quran, and I want to say, you know, how do I get to a hotel? And he was very tall, and I'm not very tall. He looked down at me contemptuously, and he said, well, if that's what you wish to learn, you should have gone to a trade school. So I thought, yeah, I guess so. Well, eventually I did go to that trade school. Eventually I went to the Foreign Service Institute, which is the State Department's trade school for teaching Arabic. So I learned to talk to people about climate change and how to read the newspaper. But those people never learned to read the Quran. And I saw that repeatedly, that I was at a big advantage when talking to Saudis because I had read the Quran and I could quote parts of it. And my other friends were completely unable to do that because they had only been to the Foreign Service Institute. So yes, it was a big help to me.
Well, tell us something about the writing of your book. I mean, when did you actually start to write the book, and what were your sources? What were you working from as you tried to convert so much life experience into the text we have before us?
Well, I think there were a couple of sources. In a sense, for the 30 years that I worked on Saudi Arabia, and there were several years that I worked on it in Washington as well, I simply gathered information from my daily work. However, I did also take notes on things that I observed on my travels and in Saudi Arabia. And these, when I left, I probably had 1,000 pages of notes. None of this was classified. None of this was secretive. This is just, the Ajman tribe lives in this village and most of the people in that town belong to the Subai or something along those lines. Things that the average Saudi would know, but that the average Westerner did not. So I had that source. But I also had a couple of, one time I had a dinner at my residence when I was chief of mission, and two former bosses of mine, two former ambassadors, Walt Cutler and Richard Murphy, were both there that night. And they said, you really have an obligation to write a book because you're the guy who knows most about this place, and it would be helpful to your colleagues. And I kind of didn't pay much attention for a while, but eventually that sort of resonated with me. So I did sit down and write the book, primarily originally for my colleagues at the embassy. But Bloomsbury said, I'll tell you the story. And I just said, I told Bloomsbury, look, I'm writing this book for one person. That's the next ambassador in Saudi Arabia at the American embassy. And they said, that's great, but we would like to sell more than one book. So, so they did help me, and we made it a little bit less encyclopedic and a little bit more readable. So that's kind of the story of how it was written.
Well, if you note in your preface, when you were sent on your first posting to Saudi Arabia in 1981, America was still coming to terms with the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the fall of the Shah, and how America, quote unquote, lost Iran. To avoid repeating that mistake in Saudi Arabia, your bosses in the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh tasked you with spending 10 days of the month traveling small towns and back roads to take the pulse of the kingdom. For 2 years, how did that experience shape your understanding of Saudi Arabia and the social contract between the rulers and their subjects?
Well, it shaped my whole approach to Saudi Arabia really for the rest of my career. It was a unique experience. I think one more person did it after I was done, but they don't do that anymore. And so it was a unique opportunity that I had. The first point was, in the short run, I became convinced that there was not going to be a revolution in Saudi Arabia. And I came back and I wrote a long report about that, which many people dismissed. They're saying, well, who is this kid? He's just as his first job, and what does he know? And he's going to tell us there's no revolution, and then we're going to all be left looking dumb. So they didn't really want to believe me, but I was convinced that there would not be a revolution in Saudi Arabia for several reasons. And one of them you just alluded to, which was the relationship between the Saudi people and the monarchy. It was distinctly different than that which existed in Iran. I'll just give you an example. In Iran, they had the what they called the White Revolution, which was to say the Shah consolidated villages. He would say, look, your village is too far out in the middle of nowhere. I can't run power lines to you. I can't run water lines to you. So I'm going to forcibly reconsolidate you or consolidate you in a town, and I'm going to give you electricity, and I'm going to have a clinic, and I'm going to have a school, and you'll all be happy. But in fact, the people were not happy because they had to move from their village. So the Saudis did that entirely differently. The Saudis said, you want to stay in your village? That's okay. We can't bring you electricity, but we'll bring you a generator. We can't bring you a water line, but we'll have a water truck come there twice a week. We'll send a bus to get your kids so that they can go to school in the town. They were completely 180 degrees different than the way the Shah did it. In other words, rather than force the people to do something that he thought was a good idea, like the Shah, the King of Saudi Arabia, said, fine, we'll let you stay with what's comfortable for you. So that was just one example of many that I saw about a sensitivity that the Saudis had. Schools were another one, that even until very recently, many Saudi schools were essentially one-room schoolhouses, very small. And this doesn't make much sense. We got rid of those in the United States 100 years ago. We consolidated into school districts. There's Saudi people, every tribe wanted to have a school for themselves. And so they would keep these small schools. So they were very sensitive to that. The other thing that they did, and again, this is a result of the fact that they had a lot of oil money, was that, but they did distribute that money. There's a village that, and I continued to visit many of these places over the next 30 years. And so there's a village south of Riyadh. First time I went there, I said, what do you people need? And they said, oh, we need a paved road. That was in the 80s. I came back in the 90s, talked to pretty much the same people, said, well, what do you need? And they said, well, we got our road and now we need a clinic. And I swear this is true. I went back and saw them, another 10 years later. And I said, so you got your clinic, what do you need now? And they said, I'm not making this up. They said, we need a community college. So these are people who went from not having a paved road to wanting a community college. So clearly life was getting better for them. So I concluded that there probably was not going to be a revolution anytime in the near future. And I think that's been borne out by the fact that the Saudis did not support the Al-Qaida insurrection that took place in 2003 to 2007, which they had a chance to violently overthrow their government. And they did not support in any significant way the Arab Spring in 2011, which was, if you will, a more peaceful protest movement. So that's the macro picture, or sort of the political picture. I think in the personal relationship that I developed with Saudi Arabia, I got to like the place. I got to like the people. I got to improve my Arabic. And the hospitality of the Saudis was something that, they're well known for. I think I would tell you two little stories that illustrate things that I learned about Saudi Arabia. One was about hospitality. I stopped at a place with a guy he was the Emir of Wadi Dawasar, and I stopped and saw him in the morning, and I was just chatting with him, having coffee, and then I had to go on to another meeting in another town. And he said, well, stay for lunch. And I said, well, I can't stay for lunch. I have to go on to this other meeting. And he was quite upset that I was leaving without having had lunch. And he said, okay, well, we'll go out he lived in sort of looked like a medieval castle, really. It was sort of a courtyard in his little fort that he'd had. And he said, just wait here for a minute. He said something that I didn't understand or didn't hear. And then a minute later, somebody comes back carrying a big sheep. And he says, no one will say that you left my house without being fed, and you will take this sheep with you. So I had a Jeep, and they put this sheep in the back of my Jeep, and off I went to my next meeting, where when I arrived there, I thought, oh, this is great. They're going to say, why do you have this sheep in your car? And you got it from the Emir of Wadi Dawasar. Well, if he gave you one, we'll have to give you two. So you'll have to have a flock by the time you get home. So I said, what am I going to tell these people? So I said, well, we in the American Embassy, we like to be prepared. And so I always carry water. I always carry a spare fan belt. I always have a spare tire. And I usually carry a spare sheep as well. And they said, wow, you guys are really on the ball. That's impressive. Even we didn't think of that. You always carry a spare sheep. So so they put my sheep in their flock. And, I didn't get back to Riyadh for several days. So I repeated this episode several times. So anyway, that was a story about the hospitality. But I think on a more serious note, the first time I went down the Hijaz Railway, which I think a lot of people wanted to do, you wanted to see the wrecks of the trains that Lawrence had blown up. But this is in the middle of nowhere. This is in the desert. And in those days, it was, and probably still is to some extent, it's not dangerous, but there's a potential for being robbed, if you will, in not any event. You don't want to go there alone. And so I had the Saudis sent couple of Bedouin with me, in particular one to be my guide. And he was well armed. And we stopped one night and we were camped out, and I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning to hear this voice. And it was just the two of us. And it's 4 o'clock in the morning and I hear this noise, what's going on? And I look over and this guy is praying. And I was pretty new to Saudi Arabia, and I thought, oh, why is this guy getting up at 4 in the morning to do this? There's, there's no social pressure on him to do this. I mean, the only person here is me, and I'm asleep. So what's going on? And then it kind of dawned on me that this was not some kind of social pressure. This is something that he took very seriously himself, and that religion was very much alive in Saudi Arabia, perhaps more so than it was in the United States or Britain at that time. So I think those are two little vignettes that help to give you some idea of how I began to understand Saudi Arabia.
It's just such a privileged exposure to the country, and it's the kind of exposure that diplomats today, because of security concerns or other restrictions, simply don't get. But the spare sheep of diplomacy is the best anecdote I've heard. In your introduction, you say the first question to ask about Saudi Arabia is not when will its government collapse, but why is it still here? You develop at length the history of the emergence of 3 distinct Saudi states and the principles that guided the modern Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, from King Abdulaziz down to the present. How do you account for the survival of the Saudi state against all the challenges of the 20th century? Imperialism, secular nationalism, the rise of political Islam in both its Shiite and Sunni variations.
This is something that I developed over really a whole career to try and answer that very question. And in the end, I believe that there are 4 legs that Saudi stability principally stands upon. The first is the historic legitimacy that the Al Saud family has because they created the country. They unified what were a collection of small city states and wandering tribes. And so much in the sense that Bismarck unified Germany or Cavour unified Italy, created something that didn't exist before, the Saudi family did that. And that gives them some legitimacy, quite a bit of legitimacy. The second thing that they did was they managed a system of succession, which again was somewhat unusual, certainly in the Arabian Peninsula. One of their rival families, the Al Rashid, had murdered the last 8 emirs of their dynasty. And the Al Saud themselves had problems with that in the past. So they created a method that peacefully and quickly transferred power. And that, again, was unusual in many of the Middle Eastern states. And that also provided legitimacy. The third leg of their stool, if you will, or table of stability was elite cohesion and balancing stakeholders. There are stakeholder groups in Saudi Arabia. Each of them has an elite that is recognized. Some are more formal than others. And the monarchy has a symbiotic relationship with them in that the elite bring their followers to support the monarchy, and the monarchy supports those elite so that they remain the leaders of their community. So this is a relationship that has functioned effectively for a long time with the tribes, with the religious establishment, with the merchant class, with the new modern technocratic class, and amongst the royal family itself, which I view as basically a hereditary political party in a one-party state. Then the final issue was, what do they provide the average person, the average individual? And here again, they have provided, by Middle Eastern standards, a competent government for a long time. And what does that mean? Number one, that means security. Saudi Arabia has not had civil wars, invasions, revolutions, coups. All of these things which plague many Middle Eastern countries have really not happened to any great extent in Saudi Arabia. So they provided security. They provided economic development, which we've talked a bit about. And they have, and again, economic development, I should point out, is not automatic. It's not just because you have oil that you're going to have economic development. That's, I think, it's a gross underestimation of what they actually achieved. You look at Venezuela, you look at Libya. I mean, Libya is hardly even a country anymore. You look at what happened in Iran or Iraq or Nigeria. Just because you have oil doesn't mean you're going to be economically able to develop your country. And then the final thing that they did was they provided gradual social change at a pace that most people would find acceptable. And it's a misunderstanding to believe that the Saudi people are chafing for nightclubs and miniskirts, and that the El Saud are holding them back. Actually, in many cases, the people have been more conservative than the monarchy, and the monarchy has actually pushed them forward. But by and large, they've gone at the pace that the people wanted. But I just would mention that, you know, when they introduced girls' education, and some of your listeners would know this, but they had to use the military to actually, if you will, integrate schools the same way they did in the American South when they desegregated those schools. People were killed in riots that affected the first television station, which people were protesting against at TV because they thought that was against Islam. So the government has actually been reasonably progressive in that point. And what I would really say is that they've gone at a pace that was acceptable to most people. So those are the four legs of stability. In terms of the specific points you mentioned, I think that's kind of an interesting to comment on that. Saudis have a very different relationship with imperialism than most Middle Eastern countries. They were never colonized. They have basically a positive relationship with the American oil men who came there and developed it. And the British government never dominated them in the same way that it dominated Iraq or Egypt. And in fact, the British were very influential in helping them to get rid of the Ottomans. So, something you would know a great deal about. And so, whereas in Egypt or Iraq, the origin of the state is from an anti-imperialist, let's get rid of the Westerners because they're not helping us. In Saudi Arabia, it's quite the opposite. In Saudi Arabia, the British are helping us get rid of the Ottomans and the Americans are helping us find oil. So they had a very different relationship to imperialism than much of the Arab world. Nationalism was until recently not a very important issue in Saudi Arabia. Their ideology was really more religion. And then again, this is quite similar. One way I look at Saudi Arabia is to study European history and just to see how it evolved. And you can often see very similar parallels. And there was a time in European history when religion was really the primary ideological force. And slowly after the French Revolution, that was replaced by nationalism. And that's beginning to happen in Saudi Arabia today. But nationalism up until fairly recently they didn't even have a national day, just for example. National Day was considered against Islam because you should only have Eid. And so now but that's changed. Now they actually have National Day. So again, that's an indication of that change. And then the final thing I would say about religion is that the Saudi interpretation of Hanbali Islam, which often goes by the name of Wahhabism in the West, basically raises allegiance to the ruler to a religious responsibility. In other words, they believe that stability it's a little bit of a chain here, but what they really believe is that in order to be saved on Judgment Day, you need to live in an Islamically governed state. To have an Islamically governed state, you need to have stability. To have stability, you need to have one ruler who nobody revolts against. And therefore, this supporting of the existing government becomes a religious duty. And what that means is that they don't really worry, that is to say, the religious scholars don't worry about how you got to power. We in the West are very concerned about whether or not you were elected. They don't really care how you got to be the king, whether you murdered your brother or got elected doesn't really matter. What matters is how you do your job once you are the king. And that's what determines your continued legitimacy. So attitude toward religion has been a little bit different than in many, actually in the West and even some Arab countries. And therefore that also has contributed to their stability. So hopefully that answered your question.
Well, you've identified key stakeholders in the Saudi system as the tribes, the religious clerics, the merchants, the technocrats, and the members of the royal family itself. So how has the balance of power between the stakeholders changed since you first went to the kingdom nearly 40 years ago?
Some stakeholders have seen their influence decline. I would say that the tribes and the religious establishment they're certainly still important, but they are less important than they were 40 years ago, particularly the religious establishment, which at one point had a role in selecting the monarch. They don't anymore. So, or at least let's be clear, they had a role in the abdication of King Saud. So the tribes and the religious community have lost influence. I think the technocrats, the modern secularly educated technocrats and the business community have seen their influence and importance to society grow. The royal family itself has seen it remains important, but the number of members of that family that are important has declined, so it has become more concentrated. And then I would add that there are a couple of new stakeholder groups, which I would say are youth and women, who are they were totally non-existent stakeholder groups before, and they are not organized and they're not politically active in the same exact sense that these other groups are. They don't have an organized elite that deals with the monarchy, but they are stakeholder groups that the government now pays attention to. So I would say that's how the stakeholder groups have changed.
Your book is really about domestic Saudi politics and not so much about its foreign relations. You're particularly discreet about Saudi-US relations, which I think is a real strength of the book. You didn't make this into a study of Saudi-America relations. You don't tend to view the kingdom through American lenses. But America could be added to your list of stakeholders in the Saudi system. So let's bring America into the discussion. In your experience as a diplomat, how have U.S.-Saudi relations evolved over the past 40 years?
Well, that's a good question. I think you're right. You could consider the United States a stakeholder in the Saudi government. Over the past 40 years, some things have changed and some things have remained constant. What has remained constant is that Saudi Arabia, at the end of the day, depends upon the United States for its security. And Saudi Arabia remains, at the end of the day, very important to the global economy. Those things existed 40 years ago and they still exist, those issues or those facts. What has changed is the Cold War has ended. The first part of my career, every day I got up and looked in the mirror and said, what am I going to do to beat the Soviet Union today? And I tell you another interesting story. That was very clear because this is a sidelight, but when I was a very junior officer in Washington, Ronald Reagan came and gave us a speech. And he said, my plan for dealing with the Soviet Union is simple. Some of you will think it simplistic. And I remember thinking, that's a big word. I thought this guy was, is this a sort of a dumb actor? He says, and some of you will think my plan simplistic. And then he just looked out at us all and he said, we're going to win, they're going to lose, and you're going to do it. And I thought, wow, then you can go play golf for the rest of the day because he did his job. I mean, he told everybody very clearly what was going to happen and how it was going to happen and what we were supposed to do. So for the first part of my career, that is pretty much what we tried to do. And the Saudis helped us. The Saudis were one country that never shirked, whatever we asked them to do, they were willing to help, whether it was, funding Contras in Nicaragua, which some people didn't like, or supporting the Mujahideen, or helping in Africa. In many ways, they were a very strong ally in the Cold War. Cold War went away, and then we had what we would call, I guess, the war on terror. And again, that the Saudis became strong allies in that. So one conflict was replaced by support in another. I think something else which changed really were the economic factors. The United States is not Saudi Arabia's biggest trading partner anymore. We were for a long time. Now Europe and Israel and China are their biggest trading partners. And also Russia has become their partner in energy markets. So China and Russia are much more important to Saudi Arabia commercially than they were in the past. And then the final thing I would say is that what has remained constant in the relationship is its volatility. It's always volatile. I mean, these are countries that have shared interests and not a lot of shared values, at least in most of the history that I've been involved with. And the relationship is always up and down, but within a certain set of parameters. And the other thing about it is that it has remained a very personalized relationship. There is a king and there is a president, and the relationship really does revolve a lot about the relationship between those two. Who is the prime minister of Great Britain and the president of the United States matters to some extent, but those relationships are largely institutionalized and not going to change overnight. That's not true with the relationship with Saudi Arabia. The king could decide tomorrow he doesn't like Saudi or doesn't like America, and he decides he wants to be the friend of China or something. And the president has, a Congress that he's got to bring along, and that costs him politically. Often, I've seen that many times, that the president has to spend political capital to maintain this relationship, and sometimes he might not want to do that. So, so the relationship remains more personal than most other major relationships that we have. Now, what happened?
Nicely to my next question.
Okay.
The way that the Saudi-US relationship has been transformed over the past 4 years. Since Donald Trump became president in January 2017, and Mohammed bin Salman became crown prince in June of that same year, these two men have pursued policies that have fundamentally altered the Saudi system. Some might say broken the system. Certainly weakened the position of the traditional stakeholders and concentrated power in the crown prince's hands. Will these changes pave the way to necessary reforms as set out in the much touted Vision 2030? Or does disregard for the rules that held the kingdom together put the Saudi project in jeopardy?
Well, that is the key question, isn't it? That is the meat of the whole book. The first comment I would make is that I don't think that King Salman broke the system so much as recognized that the system was coming to an end. The system that had existed for the past 65 years, with one brother handing power over to another brother, was coming to a natural end because they were running out of brothers. And so they were going to have to make this transition to the third generation of princes at some point. And that was never going to be easy. So when I look at what the king has achieved, and I think he's achieved quite a lot, it's not, in my view, the fact that women are driving or he's balancing the budget, or he was at least until COVID. Those are significant. But what really is the most important achievement, in my view, is that he avoided a Game of Thrones or a family feud. It's a sort of what he avoided that is, in fact, his biggest achievement. And the 500 plus grandsons who all thought they should have become the king could have been very destabilizing. And as anyone who's been to the Middle East Center knows, they all know who Ibn Khaldun is, and they all know that Ibn Khaldun says that dynasties will last for 100 years, or at the most 3 generations, and then they will collapse. And I can assure you, King Salman has read Ibn Khaldun, and he didn't want that to happen in his watch. So he's engineered the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, no question about it. Mohammed bin Salman was the anointed, chosen person, and he did consolidate power. And that is a dramatic change in that the way the country used to operate. And whether or not it now becomes a police state or whether it becomes a more accountable monarchy is a very open question. I would have to say that at the moment, the odds, it looks like it's becoming more of a police state. Power is being concentrated. This may well have been necessary to make the changes, to make the transition. And we can only hope that when you look at the models of how European monarchies evolved, some of them evolved peacefully and some of them did not. And we can hope that the Saudi monarchy evolves peacefully. The one thing that would lead me to believe that that might happen, or 2 things. Number one, the monarchy is legitimate. And the people, most of the people support the idea of the monarchy today, in part because they don't, the different stakeholders trust the monarchy more than they trust each other. So they have a strong base to start from. And the second factor is that the ultimate goal of the monarchy is to remain influential and powerful. And if they saw that the best way to do that was to slowly relinquish some of their authority, they might be willing to do that rather than face some sort of a violent backlash. So there's a chance that they can evolve, and there's a chance that they won't. I would argue that this is really where we have a choice to make. We in the West, and I mean Britain and the United States, have a choice to make. We need friends and allies in order to defend our own security and prosperity. And that during my diplomatic career, that I was always taught that the role of American foreign policy or British foreign policy is to protect the prosperity and security of the British or American people. So to do that, we need friends and allies. And I've gone through some of the things that the Saudis have done, whether it's in oil markets or counterterrorism or promoting the peace process, or as I say, just in general, being a status quo power. These are things which are helpful to us. But on the other hand, a support for human rights is also a strength of Britain and the United States. And here, the Saudis have quite a bit to answer for, whether it's the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, the war in Yemen, the detention of dissidents. These are problems. And we have to decide, how do we protect our interests, continue to promote the reforms that are going on, this quite significant economic and social reforms that are taking place in Saudi Arabia, and also get them to improve their human rights record. And I think it's pretty clear that trying to sanction them or antagonize them in some way, isolate them, is probably not going to work with a group of people who know that they're important to the global economy and believe that they are important in creating a global religion. So they are in many ways, they have a unique culture and a unique history and a unique situation. And I don't think isolating them is likely to help us obtain our goals. And so what I would argue is that we need to figure out how to constructively engage them to work on the problems that we have, but also to continue with the positive, if you will, elements of our relationship. So yeah, I think that's what I would say about that.
Well, I think you've given good advice for the incoming Biden administration as it looks to a post-Trump relationship with Saudi Arabia. David, thank you very much. I have been speaking with author David Rundell about his book, Vision or Mirage? Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. And this has been Middle East Centre Book Talk. Thank you for listening, and goodbye from Oxford.